Hi, this is Kelly Lee. This is a recording of a talk I did with Mark Tredenick at Red Hot Arts in early October 2019. It's called Nourishing Terrains, and we chat about his essay of the same name, Nourishing Terrains, his book Blue Plateau, and stories about place, connection, and whether loneliness might be cultural. Welcome this evening to Red Hot Arts and to a chat with Mark Tredenick. We're going to be talking Nourishing Terrains, the essay and the ideas. I want to start by acknowledging that this country we're on, Mbantua, is unceded Aranda land, and that means that it still belongs to Aranda people, that we're yet to form a treaty, that we need to have a conversation. And in doing that, I want to acknowledge the owners and the custodians and the continued work they do in the face of so much struggle to maintain the stories of this place and keep it alive. And may we always recognise them as the first storytellers and learn to listen better. Before we get into conversation, I'd like you to attend to your devices, turn them on aeroplane mode or off, or whatever your choice is, whatever your flavour of off is. Bathrooms are at the back left, wine is available at the bar, and there's books for sale at the back if you'd like to have a little piece of this conversation to take home. I also want to let you know that tonight's being audio recorded, and so that audio will maybe go on NT Writer Centre website, it might go on ACCC, and so when we get to question times, which we're going to have 15 minutes for at the end, if you don't want to be recorded, just let Fiona know. Don't let that stop you from asking a question. Just let her know and then we'll edit you out or find some other way to deal with it. Welcome, Mark.
I need to get up close and, yeah.
Yep. It's always funny talking into these appendages, vocal appendages. Mark, welcome so much to in Bantua, Alice Springs. It's a pleasure to have you here chatting tonight. I'm just going to give you a bit of an intro to the lovely people here, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about Mark, and then we're going to have a bit of a yarn about this essay. So Mark Tredenick is the author of The Little Red Writing Book, The Little Black Book of Business Writing, Almost Everything I Know, and Fire Diary, The Blue Plateau, and a dozen other works of poetry and prose. This partially, some of the stack here.
Yeah, and these are a couple. And here's my very battered copy of My Love Child, The Blue Plateau.
He's a celebrated poet, essayist and writing teacher, and his best-selling books on writing craft are used in schools and university programs, and his many honours include the Montreal and Cardiff prizes, the Blake and the Newcastle Poetry Prizes, 2 Premier Literary Award, and the Calibre Essay Prize, which for those of you who are unaccustomed to writing, that's an incredibly broad span of accolades to have for a writer. Blue Plateau, The Love Child, was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Prize, and Sir Andrew Motion has said of Mark's work, he is a bold and big thinking poet in which ancient themes, especially the theme of human relationship to the landscape, are recast and rekindled. 2 new collections of poetry, Walking Underwater and The Beginner's Guide, appear in 2019, and Mark is at work on Reading Slowly at the End of Time, a memoir of the reading life. Please put your hands together and welcome Mark to Mbantua.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, Kelly Lee, for that intro.
No worries. Thank you for Fiona for sending it through. Bless. So Nourishing Terrains, the essay, some of you may have read it, some of you may have not. We're going to... Did you want to read from the Blue Plateau or Nourishing?
I'm going to, later, I'll read a little bit from the essay to begin, if that's not going to put everyone to sleep.
We're just going to start by doing a short reading from the essay to have a quick, just to warm the space and get everyone in the mood. So I'll hand on over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Kelly. This is a hell of a place you live in here. I've been here a couple of times before, but I didn't have, and I had a kind of very impressionistic recollection of just how incredible it is. And I've been saying to everyone who listen, if they ever ask me to design a landscape, this is what I would design. It's kind of partly a personal thing, I think, where like my partner's very drawn to tropical landscapes, which just don't do it for me. They never really have. I like them lean and kind of lots of rock and kind of structure and form, kind of very much like the poetry I like a lyric quality, but really structurally sound and interesting. So thanks for having me. And this is, if there's any land that's been held sacred for longer than this, I don't know where we'd find it. So I realise I enter into that. We just thought that we might. We're just going to riff on some questions that we've discussed. The ideas from this essay. I'm just going to read a little bit first, just to set it up a tiny bit. The essay was a commission from Katrina Menzies-Pike, the editor of the Sydney Review of Books. In a series, they had a little bit of funding for some writing about place. So I'd be one of the people you'd think of because it's been a kind of obsession of mine, place, and we're going to talk some more about that. But I wondered a bit what I could write at first, because I did my doctoral work in this field. I've written a number of essays. A lot of my poetry is in this space. The Blue Plateau was my attempt to kind of get down a kind of love letter for a place on Earth. And you think it is, sometimes you as a writer think, well, maybe I've kind of said everything I had thought about that, but I found myself in circumstances. A couple of things were relevant. One was that Deborah Bird-Rose, whom some of you might know, who does know Deborah or her work? And I knew Deborah personally. She was a good friend. We had founded together with Freya Matthews a thing called the Kangaloon Group of Concerned Writers, artists, and the hope for that group, which wasn't really fulfilled by that group because Deb went and died, and Martin Harrison went and died, and a number of us got distracted into life events, as I did indeed as well. My essay partly reports on those. But Deb was, she had good long notice that she probably wasn't going to last too long, and a few of us got together and wrote a book of poems for her. That'd be quite a nice thing, don't you reckon? She's married to Peter Boyle, as some of you might know. Peter's one of our great contemporary poets, and Stuart Cook was one of her doctoral students, and Stuart put this book of poems together, and I have a poem I'm proud of in that collection, which I allude to a little bit in this essay. But when Katrina insisted that I get this piece of writing done, and she said, look, it's just 1,500 words or so, it's fine. So I ended up writing 9,500 words. This is what I always tend to do. I put it off, but I thought, look, I'll do this for Deb, and I'll explore the notion that she made palatable, lyric and accessible, the idea that she phrases as nourishing terrains. And I explored it in the context of what it might be as a white fella to enter into a time of life and feel completely unhearthed, a profound sense of loneliness and unbelonging, which happens to all of us at a certain point. In my case, it happened because of marriage breakdown and alienation from children, and I began to wonder whether, in fact, my profound loneliness wasn't just personal, but might actually be cultural. In other words, do I inhabit the dispossessor's culture, which has had no account to make of the value, the meaning of a life in terms of its connection with country? And so the essay explores some ideas like that through Indigenous wisdoms, and we'll talk some more about that, but also through Western epistemologies, which have a place for that kind of understanding as well. So in this bit here, it's 2/3 of the way into the essay. An East Coast low blows the third week of June inland. After the hottest summer anyone can recall and the driest fall, the days remember how to rain, and the nights are the kind of cold winter is supposed to be. Daffodils push up through the garden beds, spring released at last to anticipate its own coming. Tonight as rain fell on the tiled roof and the gas heater threw out its heat, I sat on the couch and reread a poem of Linda Gregg's I've loved for years, long before I knew what it articulated, knowing that I'd know in time. And now's the time. Adult, it's called. And she calls it that as if she knew what Seamus Heaney meant when he wrote in crediting poetry, "Poetry can make an order where we can at last grow up to that which we stored up as we grew." Isn't that great? Gregg's poem puts well what I have done, coming back to the Winja Caribbee, Gundungurra country, and how that feels, the bewilderment of return, of advancing years, the losses, the burning back of youthful desire, the exile on home ground, as well as the accomplishments, many of them so hard won, incidental now to one's sense of what one's life has meant. So here's Linda Gregg's poem. So I'm sitting there as the rain beats down and it tries to pretend it really is winter. I've come back to country where I was happy, changed. I could be the ghost of my own life, returning to places I lived best, walking here and there, nodding when I see something I cared for deeply. Now I'm in my house, listening to the owls calling and wondering if slowly I will take on flesh again. In the midst of loss that won't stop leaving, grief that won't stop grieving, but refuses to be said, is it possible that the flesh you put on again is the body of the things around you, which you have to teach yourself all over again to regard, and which you apprehend, forcing yourself somewhat, as if for the first time? I am changed by the loss of the life I used to live here. So I've come back to the place where I was married, and my kids are just down the road, and I've moved away, but I can't see the kids, so I'm going, I wonder if I can kind of get to know myself by putting on the place again in a new kind of fashion. I am changed by the loss of the life I used to live here, the family I lived here, with the easygoing belonging that allowed. I am changed by the loves I've had and lost, the confusion I've felt, the harm I've caused others, the woman I loved, the children I always will, others whose love I've not been able to hold and honour in the unending season of my anguish. Wonder, which was easy once, is hard work now. I know, though, that the way outside myself is the way back to myself. To be lost to oneself is a chance to find oneself changed, perhaps improved, in all that isn't merely oneself. You see where I'm going with this? Mm-hmm. A friend, this friend is Curly Saunders. I don't know if you know Curly's work.
She was at the festival this year.
There you go. So this is Curly. A friend, grieving her own loss, sends me some words which she reads on the train. So what I'm loving about this is the multiculturalism of all of this, of course, because I've got Curly sending me Rilke to console me in country that she grew up in. She grew up in Bowral. Actually, she doesn't live there anymore, but that's where I am now. Friend, grieving her own loss, sends me some words which she reads on the train. I know the book they come from, almost word for word. It's Rilke's Letters to the Young Poet, if you know that work. And I know Rilke's poetry well, too, and I forget daily the consolation that I found there. Sometimes it takes someone else who finds comfort in words one knows, sometimes in words one has written, and who suffers too and cares for one's own sadness, to recall for you what you thought once you understood. The words were written to Mr. Capus, a young poet, by Rainer Maria Rilke on the 12th of August, 1904. And these are Rilke's words. Consider whether these great sadnesses have not rather gone right through the center of yourself, whether much in you is not altered, whether you have not somewhere, at some point in your being, undergone a change while you were sad. Were it possible for us to see further than our knowledge reaches, and yet a little way beyond the outworks of our divining, perhaps we would endure our sadnesses with greater confidence than our joys. Isn't that fantastic? Well, we're going to get back to some of that content there. So I write here, a knowing further than our knowledge reaches, is that perhaps what country is? So then, still raining, I'm reading Emily Dickinson. I'm remembering that she says, life is a spell so exquisite that everything conspires to break it. Poetry recasts it, is the point that she wants us to understand from that. So I'm writing that down. Emily Dickinson wrote that. Meaning, I think, letting yourself be again in the company of much that isn't you is the spell recast. The spell is recast when coherence resumes, when one wakes again, like the language in a poem, to all one is connected to all the rest of who you are. And much of it, that ecosystem of self, is the other forms of life, fast and slow, human and animal, and tree and sky and river, without any of which that small and entire universe of self, with a capital S, would be less exquisite and less whole. And meaning, Emily Dickinson again, includes one's place among them. It includes one's place among those things, but it isn't reducible to that. One is neither their author nor their arbiter, but their steward and their witness and their kin. And meaning, belonging, is the uncanny order and freedom that all these forms of life imply together. The rightness, the ineluctability, the entirety. It is the self just beyond our divining. It is not so much the forms, though, but what joins them. This is the kind of ecological insight that finds its analogue in indigenous wisdoms, I think. It's not so much just the forms, but what joins them. It is the space between. That is the self. That is the nourishing terrain. And nothing is missing from it. Not the past, nor the present, nor the ones you miss, nor the stolen, nor the dead. I might leave it there. After that, I kind of go outside with all these grand ideas in my head, thinking that I'm going to bump into a kind of renewed sense of country. And what happens is, of course, I just get wet because it's raining really hard. And then what happens is I see not a kangaroo or anything else, but a fox. Because this is, of course, part of country too. You know, it's been altered. And the fox is this beautiful, brilliant thing, an embodiment of ingenuity and fire and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And also it's causing havoc to the, you know, to the life there. So the piece is about just acknowledging the complexities of what it might mean. And I'm catching myself out getting nice and idealistic. I mean, I believe that shit there. I really do. I think that that's kind of, for me, that was getting at what it is that not only I've lost, but nearly everybody has lost in a system where we haven't got an account to make of self that includes geology and, you know, landform and place and other cultures and whatnot. But also, you know, there are foxes in the gardens and we've got to decide whether we're going to shoot them or, you know, or whether they're just cute or not. Life is like that. So there's a little bit, just I guess, to get us begun.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. There's a lot in there to get us begun. Hope you've all cancelled your plans for this evening. If we're going to get through all of that, Elliot has babysitting about to expire. Bless.
See ya.
Mark, there's so much in this essay about returning to country. You know, you're returning to a place, rediscovering yourself there. You know, as if for the first time, but changed, as you say. You know, trying on this skin. But at the point at which you write this essay, you have been writing with and learning with country for quite some time.
Yeah.
So, where does this begin? Where is there a genesis that you can trace to this connection of country? Why? Where did this start and why?
It's funny. So I'm one of four children of Heather and Bruce Tredenick. Tredinnick's the Cornish name, and it's my father's, and his grandfather was a Methodist minister and travelled a country a lot, but, you know, in a pastoral, you know, kind of way, not as a land user or living off country. But, you know, he was a practical man. I remember, as well as his sermons, I've got his preaching Bible on my desk still, and he's got the sermons interleaved, and they're pretty stern. They're pretty stern stuff. These are Methodists, right? No drinking, not a whole lot of dancing. I don't know what account they had to make of sex, but apparently some of that happened. But you know, I'm one of four boys, and none of like one of my brothers is a musician, one's an optometrist, another is a insurance kind of person. That's a terrible way to describe him, but anyway, none of my family has got the same. Has got any of that stuff, that kind of sense of yearning for this being land as kind of the embodiment of meaning and finding self again. So look, I don't know. I think these things are delightfully mysterious. Your story is a bit, in a sense, more direct, isn't it? So I found my way. I'd been a lawyer briefly, and I was a publisher for 10 years, and then I found myself finally finding my writing calling. And when that happened, I thought, well, I have this longing to write, but I don't know what. I may write a novel someday, but fiction's not really my bag. I wrote a little bit, some time ago, but poetry and essay, lyric non-fiction were, and the writers whose work just leapt off the page for me were all the nature writers. Many of the North Americans and some of the English writers and Irish and some others. And at that stage, it seemed to me I'd found a calling, but also that I'd remembered this feeling that I'd carried from my childhood for almost the divinity of places and all places, but particularly those with some scrub still standing that hadn't been bulldozed, that kind of place, especially. And I can't really put that down to anybody. I came in that way. I would suggest it's got something to do with my grandfather and both of my grandmothers, who were very grounded country women. But I think sometimes we're not explicable. Do you find that for your own life? Like I don't think you can name everything about my parents in my case, and you won't understand how you get what you get with this. And I don't know what that is. Maybe I'm adopted. Maybe the Greeks said it right. They had this idea that each of us is a what they called the genius, just a spirit floating around out there. And at a certain point, we go, yeah, you'll do. You look like the parents who might be the people I need to kind of cut up against, and that's how it feels a bit like to me. But what about you? Your connection's a bit different.
Yeah, I guess for me, I grew up in the top end and on country and really from my father, and as we were talking about before, they were like poor Irish folk basically in Darwin, and in those days, refrigerated trucks weren't a thing, and so hunting and fishing were, when my father was a child, a way to get tucker and protein, and so, my father really, and I think this is something that we really, and Darwin in the 40s and 50s, it was prior to the referendum, but in that small town there was so much overlap, and so I think that there was a lot of learning about the concept of country from Larrakia people and First Nations people up there that has carried, not in any explicit, my parents are by no means lefty kind of people, but like there's a deep love of country that I was raised in, and I've just come back from actually spending time on that country and the things that we were talking about how country holds time, and that I feel like there's things that country holds, and they give it back to you, when you're ready for it, which is something that I really sense in your essay. And I was thinking, like my father, he could read country in a certain way, but in your writing, it reminds me of something that Deb Bird-Rose talks about in her book Country of the Heart, and she is working with Muk women, who are women from the area that people know as Litchfield National Park, and she talks about this idea of country is always talking to itself, and the language of country is sensual, and that this is something I think that's really comes through in this essay, is this sensual language of country. And I wonder, how do you hear and do you speak back? And what is it to translate that onto the page? Can you tell us more about this, central engagement and then the interface between country self and page and that process of mediation and translation?
It is sensual, very, very strongly so. So yesterday, we drove out to Ormiston Gorge. So that's in the West Max. What's the proper name for the West Max?
Is it
I took it down. I took a shot. Yeah. And so you know what that's like, right? So I am kind of going, how did you get like this? What I was thinking of, I remember when I did my doctoral work, is it in that book? I wrote my doctoral work, became a book called The Land's Wild Music. And in that book, I think I'm talking about imagining a geologist as a psychotherapist sitting with country and going, okay, I see how things stand. How did they get to this? How did it get this way? Like, the kind of, that country out there is... So the Blue Plateau is about the Blue Mountains. Have you been to the Blue Mountains? Anyone been there? That's essentially very simple, profound, but simple country. It's just it's sandstone, sand deposited in two major long iterations. So there's Hawkesbury sandstones and Narrabeen sandstones. Some came in from the west, some from the north. Just lies there for a hell of a long time. Gets really hard, gets uplifted and tilted a bit and eroded. That's it. And you've only got to look at that country out there on that, road. And is it the Fink River that comes along through there, or the Hugh or something, to realise that you're looking at incredibly contorted country that's been through all manner of mischief and uplift and outrage and everything. So I'm going, how did you get like this? How did this happen? And I feel it kind of speaking through its layers. I don't want to get too kind of juju about it, but it is actually, I just wrote to my mate, the poet Steve Armstrong, before I came here, and he said, oh, I'm so jealous, mate, you're out there in that country, it's like the flanks of an animal. And I said, not quite the metaphor I would have gone for exactly, but I felt, I suppose this is a lyric way of being. And I think I just have it, and I think if you're going to be a poet, you have to have it, and you have to realise that there are practices involved in opening your perceptive faculties, and giving credit, as Seamus Heaney says in crediting poetry, giving credit to that kind of intuition that is discredited or has no place in Western epistemologies. You just go, yeah, I'm feeling this thing, this is true. So I swear to goodness, I could feel what that seabed felt like, that were the bottom layers there, and I could feel the charge in the uplift. And I had to go down to Bronwyn's bookstore and get the books on geology, because I just need to know what science says about what that story is like. But there is a sense of, country as being alive with, I really love that metaphor that Deb uses, speaking to the women there. The country's always speaking. It's talking to itself, and you can overhear it. In one of my poems, I say, for me, what poetry is an overhearing of the music of the intelligence of things. Poetry actually it overhears the music of the intelligence of things. So the kind of sing-song, one way or another about how things got to be like this, and you'll never get to the end of the story of how a place like that gets to be like that. I mean, for me, it's uncanny to think that when those rocks that are the bottom layers out there were formed, they were the bed of a sea, and there was no life. There was no life. Like, there were no fish. There was a bit of algae. There were no trees. There's nothing green. Imagine the world like that. So we were talking before about slowness and geologic time, and that for me is uncannily attractive and very, very wise. Like, it seems to me the counterpoint that we need these digital days to the kind of haste of everything, the kind of incredible slowness. You talk about places, being where time is stopped or stilled. That's right, but there's still the movement, like the energy, the charge of all of the times that led up to this is still kind of present somehow. And I think poets like me and and other people with that kind of almost tragic falling for country are kind of alive to everything that is not visible or immediately apparent or explicable or reducible in any way. It's the best show in town. I mean, for me to have a day in country just like that, there's nothing kind of better. And then I feel as a writer as though, I guess I feel as a person enlarged and humble at the same time, like incredibly small in that scheme of things. But I was scribbling on I sometimes draft poems on my phone these days. You do that too, just on the notes thing. And I had that line about there's been an uprising in the outback. It doesn't look like it ended all that well. And then I was going, just to think about everything that it's taken the earth, not just cost the earth, but everything that had to be arranged and rearranged and upset and all that stuff, just for this place to be like this, just now and me in it. Everything that had to be arranged. I just feel intensely grateful for that. In the essay, I talk a little bit about trying to regain gratitude. One thing that you lose in depression is the capacity to feel grateful. Yes. And I noticed yesterday that it's come back. So something's working here. Like time passes. But I guess in terms of the essay too, the thing that maybe shocked me most was, as you say, I mean, from the time I was a child, like you, I had this sense of country as mattering. And as a writer, I've written about it endlessly. But to lose that, to feel as though I'd suddenly lost even that capacity to feel wonder and consolation in the world beyond the merely human, because that's carried me through everything, and that too went. And I thought, oh, holy hell, now what do we do? What's left now? And then, of course, I remembered that in the Blue Plateau I'd written about a practice of belonging. And sometimes I find, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of my writer friends say the same thing. I tend to write something in a poem about 10 years before I understand what it really means. And I could tell you what it means intellectually, and I could even give a thorough kind of explanation of everything that went into it. But when I wrote about the practice of belonging, I didn't realize how hard sometimes practicing belonging could actually be. You have to get out there and work against every instinct that tells you that this doesn't matter and that this is irrelevant. And so practice, as in, I sometimes go back to sporting metaphors. It's an unusual thing in a lyric poet, I know, but sport's kind of a big deal for me. But people who are out of form, like Steve Smith or somebody like that, revert to practice, to discipline. That's what gets you through when you've lost the capacity to be inspired to do this thing. You've lost the kind of wonder temporarily. You revert to technique. And so practices of belonging is kind of what I've tried to do back there in that country. And then, as my story about yesterday reveals, I suppose it comes back. I mean, don't get me wrong, I felt terrible about losing the capacity for a time for wonder, because Earth is an incredible thing, like down to the smallest detail and the biggest landforms. We've been set down in these lives in this place, on this planet, in these places. We'll talk about what places are again maybe, but I just feel as though that's an incredible gift. And if I sometimes think about what it is, why it is that I write, I think it's the only thing I've worked out that I'm able to do that might just sometimes be adequate to return the gift of being alive in country. In lots of ways.
Yeah, those practices of belonging. It reminds me of, in that same body of work, Deb, that Nancy Dayiri, one of the women who she's working with on this book, Country of the Heart. It's an incredibly beautiful book. They went out and they worked with a photographer and photographed country, and then they sat down and they talked about these photos, and then that became the book. And this senior woman, Nancy Dayiri, she talks about having the right sweat for her country. And so for her, she talks about actually taking her sweat and putting it on country, and that being the practice, of belonging, of which there are so many. And, something that Deb really talks about in Ethics for Decolonisation, and she's a big voice in this essay, and she's one of the dedications of this essay, and I'm a scholar of Deb, so this is why I kind of keep on dancing around her work and bringing her into this conversation as well. You know, this country, so much has happened here. As in all places, we are an unceded land. And so, you know, in finding that way in and searching for that connection of belonging, I was really struck when you were talking about this idea that Deb talks about, you know, when we enter country, we encounter love and violence, that these things occur together. And so, and we find them in ourselves as well. You know, it's really, her work is a refusal of those binaries of love and violence. And I wonder, how do you gesture to this, you know, in your work, encountering that both in landscape, and you talk about this, you know, with the fox, of going out and you're looking for the sign, and there's a fox, and it's like, well, I'm that fox too, and aren't you beautiful? But probably eating or everything, you know, and how do you encounter and reckon with, if, you know, I don't know if reconciliation is possible with him, but how do you reckon with this love and violence in the interface between self and country, and in writing country, you know, from the positionality of a settler?
You know, I don't know. Spiritual systems the world over are very good at giving us a language, at giving us koans. You know, in the Buddhist tradition, the koan often entails a kind of unfathomable rhythm about the coexistence of, you know, contradictions. Koan is Koan. Some of you might know about that. Like, you know, the face I had before my parents were born. Those kind of, you know, notions, and they take you into contemplation. But religious systems everywhere, at their best, are good at recognizing the contradictions of truth, the coexistence of opposites, and love and pain. Blake, you know, wrote about joy and pain and the andness of that. So there are places, I guess, that have schooled me, and where I find these things written, and remember not to give up when it's painful, because, you know, that's the co-relative, the kind of counterpoint, contrapuntal of, you know, the love and delight that's either just happened or it's just about to. I speak about this expressly in the essay, I think, don't I? But I guess what I also wanted to say was I sometimes talk to my writing students, and I might say this on tomorrow, who knows? When I think about the writing that I think is the best, that's kind of done the distance, it's often one of the things that characterizes it is the coexistence of levity and gravity. And the words, I think, are quite powerful and useful because they mean a couple of different things. But, you know, a lightness of touch. Like in that essay there, that was all very grave, and then I go out and walk into the rain and the fox. And I think what I've learned as a technician in writing is that you don't do justice to anything, a love affair, loss, grief, country, anything, if you remain in one mode, if it's all mourning, or if it's all kind of, you know, delight or something. And there's something in the trade between them, and the quick, hey, fox-like, you know, kind of movement from one to the other that's erotic in the full senses of that word, and therefore does justice to the eroticism of, you know, of real life, which includes its tragedy and its delight. So technically, since you ask a question about getting it into the writing too, I suppose I certainly am not out there looking for the oppositions. I think that would seem to me to be overconstructed. I think I'm pre-programmed to perceive it in those ways, but I've also learned that it seems to be a pretty cool move, and it works in literary terms, like art of all kinds. Think of Indigenous, you know, paintings. Think of Shakespeare. Think of right across all kind of art forms. The best forms will make you laugh and make you cry. I think, as I say, that of Debussy's music, for example, or Bach, or jazz, Bill Evans or somebody. Like across all the art forms, there's this movement from the sublime to the ridiculous, really quite fast. And I think the reason why that works is that that's what, as human beings, we recognize life to be like. And we need both ends of the spectrum, but we need the and in between. Otherwise, we just can't get on, and otherwise there's no learning to be had or movement to be made.
We're on such a short timeline. I'm just going to ask one last question, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So, if you,
I hope you wrote your questions down.
yeah, if you want to formulate,
Because we'll be asking everyone to ask a question tonight. It's a new approach.
yeah, we've got under your seat. There's a number, and so we'll draw.
Yeah.
We'll draw.
Some of you win the car, but other people just get a question to ask.
It's not a very good car. It's my car. Those of you who know me know that I don't have a very good car. It's a great car, but it's not very flash. So, towards the end of this question, this essay, Mark, you walk us through so many entry points in your relationship with country and in dialogue with so many other voices. And at the end, you kind of talk about this idea of coming home to our earth and ourselves entails also cleaning up the mess we've made and redeem all humanity of a little of the harm we've done to the first peoples, to other clans, and to our children. And I really love this because it locates us in time. And I'm thinking here of Deb's essay, Anthropocene Noir, but it's in a lot of her other work as well, of us, a responsibility in both directions to both ancestors and descendants, and what it means to be located within a lineage of time, within a place, within country. And so I'm interested in, as we close up our little part of this discussion, how might belonging enable us to develop frameworks of moral responsibility, or what does country teach us about this? And I know that there's some other work that you're doing now, and in relation to art and activism and country. So, as we wind up this part of the conversation, where does this leave us?
Yeah.
Where do we journey from once that page closes?
I think you're alluding on the way through there. There's a book that came out last year, a book of poems came out from a press called Copper Canyon. If you're a poet and you wanted to get published in America, Copper Canyon would be your publisher. They're the kind of Faber and Faber, fantastic press. And an editor put together a book of poems from all around the world just called Here, H-E-R-E. Isn't that great? Here, Poems for the Planet. But the book includes not just a selection of poems, it's got instructions in the back for how to get involved locally in activist projects to save places, to save cultures, to work on redeeming languages. So it's this lovely and rather uncommon connection between art and activism. So in terms of making a difference, there are roles for many of us that are different roles, and we need them all to be fulfilled. I think ecologically about that. I've, from time to time, been inclined to think that the work that I seem called to do, which is this and this, I guess, and, being a father and having a little bit of land and that kind of stuff, isn't the kind of, it's not heroic in that. Like, it's not heroic activism of a kind that I respect, too, and that we need to see done. That Curly Saunders is doing fantastic work for the conservation of Indigenous languages, for example. I think that's fantastic work. I don't think it's my work. I don't think it can be my work, but I applaud her in doing it, and I'm so glad that she's doing that work. Early on, I had, just to kind of wrap up this kind of conversation, I suppose one does what one can, and literature's part of it. I'm quite passionate about the fact that I think we're in the midst of an ontological crisis. That's a fancy word that kind of, for me, means what I was getting at there. We've lost a sense of who we are, what being, and how to be with each other and be with the earth. And when I say we there, I mean in the dominant cultures, the kind of capitalist discourses and so on, which haven't had an account to make, that regarded anything other than what's measurable in money terms as being of any kind of relevance. So we've remade our lives in a suburban fashion, and we've told them in prose, and the prose is really bad prose. So we've got ourselves kind of disconnected and disenchanted, and in the process disenchanted, the natural world and many of our human relations. So the two things it seems to me we need to recover are a connection to country and a sense of the lyric. The kind of rhythmic, memorable speech, not this inadequate discourse that passes as adequate in our universities, in our political systems, in our daily lives. We need poetry. We need what it is that it does. There are cultures on the earth that haven't lost their connection to the primacy of poetry as a profoundly human discourse. We've turned it into this thing that some weird people do at the edges, of our culture. Poetry carries civilization on its back more than any of the other art forms, because it's this profound human thing. We're languaging creatures. Poetry is language at its very best. If we're not doing that, we're less than we might be, and we're missing something. So I do take kind of seriously, maybe I'm just making a huge case for the only thing that I seem capable of doing, which is poetry, but I do actually think that we've got ourselves terribly disconnected from the lyric. And we need it again to rediscover the rest of our humanity. And of course, it's intimately connected with the connection to country in Indigenous cultures and in others. You need to know the songlines, you need to know the rhythm structure, not just what the story is, as it might be told in prose, but actually how it sounds, syllable by syllable. And that's the thing that's poetry, and poetry carries that on. So the lyric is actually powerfully politically important. So I think those of us who are doing that work need to be supported as well as we can be. But actually one of my missions is to reawaken an understanding of poetry, what it is, how to practice it, and how to read it, and why it's so important. And not just poetry as sort of sonnets and villanelles and sieges and so forth, but a poetic way of being in the world. That's one of my missions, and I think that's part of it. That's long, slow work, but I'm starting on Sunday here. In fact, I've started now. But the rest of it, for me, I suppose, I think I had a conversation back in 2002 when we just founded the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, Kate Rigby and I and some others. And we had, what's her name again? Milne. What was her first name again? The Greens. Christine, thank you. And she spoke she was the keynote at our festival that we had. And I listened to her and I thought, that's what we need. We need that kind of activism, that kind of dedication. And I was a bit down in the mouth. And I said, I'm just standing here thinking that what's the use of pretty words about pretty country? What we need is activism. She said, no, you need to remember that what's motivated revolutions at every stage has been art. There's been poetry and philosophy and right thinking and art practice. And she said for me and for Bob, meaning Bob Brown, and others, it was Thoreau. And it was an encounter with exactly that kind of writing. And so we're back to the lyrics. So we need to cultivate whatever that means in ourselves, in our own writing practices, in our reading, and in our children. We need to cultivate that kind of literary practice that remembers the earth in every phrase. That's really important. And then we need to get out and not miss any opportunity to do whatever we can, small or large, to kind of make change. Now, I heard Donald Trump the other day. What did he say? He said, the future belongs to the patriots, not to the globalists. Don't you get depressed when you hear that shit? Like, after all this time, and I'm thinking, are there any other options? And of course there are other options. The future belongs to the globalist and the localist. Patriotism's got nothing to do with it. It's a complete fraud. It always was. But, kind of connection to place, whatever that is, that realm of intimate connection, and that replicated worldwide is where the future, has to lie. And, however we can find to contribute to that is what we should be doing, I guess.
In the words of M.K. Turner, everything comes from the land.
Yeah.
To open it up for questions, does anyone have a question?
We want you for all time. We want you recorded. So,
Thanks, Stu. So I was just saying the poetry and writing. I feel it's a time where the reader has to themselves quite a rare time. Especially life is pretty busy these days, and I think that time to come back into yourself and read another person's creation, and that person isn't with you anymore. They're there through the words, but it's you and the book or you and the poem is an act of environmentalism, because you're reconnecting with yourself, and from that space you can formulate how to move forward. So it's like another layer to what you were saying, I think.
yeah, thank you for that. That's really fabulous. I agree, and you've helped me think even, I think, a little bit more clearly about that. As I left to come here tonight, there was a guy on the balcony, loads of tats, great big hipster beard, kind of, not me. And he's reading a book. And I just thought that's a revolutionary act these days, and it's a choice that you have to make, and it's harder and harder to make, I think, isn't it? Because we have less and less time, and everything's on the screen. I like what you're saying there about the connection with the writer, because what that asserts is the power of connection between human beings and mind. So I was reading Emily Dickinson. There's no way she's dead. There is no way she's dead. I was rereading her this afternoon because her words are there and we have this connection. So that in itself is powerful for you as a writer, but it also as a reader. But that speaks to the power of the inchoate, the invisible, that which connects us, which isn't severed by even death. In that case, there's something, real there. And ecology teaches us that as well. It's the connections that sometimes are inexplicable, inchoate, invisible to us. Those are the things that make something coherent, strong. So reading and of course, as you say, taking us back into our interiority, into our self, is so important. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we? Because these, just at the time when we need to remember slowness, if you like, and interiority, the world gets faster and faster and faster. Almost, somebody once said to me, if you've got a choice between a cock-up and a conspiracy theory, go for the cock-up every time. But it's hard these days not to think that there's some kind of conspiracy to keep deflecting us from concentration on this issue, which is the issue of our times. It's the issue. It's the moral issue. It's the issue about justice, and it's the question of climate change, and everything that comes from that. And it's urgent, but we need to approach it with the wisdom that the land teaches and that literature teaches too. And that learning comes slow, and it demands solitude. So I really like what you're saying. From that. So I agree with that. Reading, I'm meant to be writing a book about the reading life, and I'm going to quote you, because I think, I do say in that already that reading is a revolutionary act, like kindness and like friendship these days. It's revolutionary to pick up a book and take the time and do whatever that is, and the rest of it is down to you. But I think it's been, to get back to that question that Kelly Lee asked me about how I found my way to country, weirdly enough, it was probably through The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and the Narnia books and, Judith Wright and Tim Winton a bit and David Malouf, and in time people like Barry Lopez and others. So literature can work an incredible change. I read a review the other day in the New Yorker of a book about the history of psychiatry, and it ends with words like these. I often get my writing students to remake a sentence that they've found and fallen in love with each week, and you've got to remake it. You can't just look at it and remember it. You've got to copy it out, because then you get your body involved in the process. But this sentence goes, I think, words, for better or worse, can change the chemical structures of our brains. That's so powerful, isn't it? Like how is kind of what I'm exploring in that essay, in a way, apart from country changing it. But if you, the way that a thing is put, so a good poem is an incredibly powerful thing. It changes things up there. In other words, it changes your mind in a way that doesn't allow you to go back again. And it's not reducible even just to what the words mean. It's down to how they're put, the rhythm structures and all of that kind of stuff. And you will be changed forever if you read. So, read well. Be discerning. Put yourself in the way of, writing that has wisdom in it, the way that, landscape has wisdom in it too. But that is kind of a political thing, isn't it? Because you'll be changed. And then the rest is up to us, what we do with that, how we teach, how we engage with others, how we treat our children and the land.
Read well, be changed, carry it into your life. We will have one quick question. We are at time, but we'll have one last quick question.
I'm not sure if it's quick or not, but you did finish up talking about place, and I'm just interested in the difference with space and using those two different words. I work a lot in the digital, and so we talk about the digital space as a different place. Yeah. So I'm just interested in those two different words.
Kelly Lee and I were rehearsing, and one of our questions was, what's the definition of place? So you're right, they are different. Place and space are different, I think. And I think there are lots of ways you might come at place, but the difference between place and space would be bodies, forms, the tactile, the actual, and the connections between the actual. So you can have a space without it being a place. There's also, space might be, I was going to say something, Kelly Lee, you'll have your thoughts about this too, but there's something about intimacy and touch and connection that place has that space doesn't. The digital realm, the digital spaces they're kind of magical, but they aren't anywhere. Like, you can't actually ever find them, and they scare me to death. Even though I love them and use them, I need to come down to earth and get the dust on my boots and, kind of touch the rock and see the actual light and get my skin burned. That's place. That doesn't happen in spaces.
I really, Lucy Lippard, who's an art critic and writer, she has a really beautiful book called The Lure of the Local. And in the first chapter of that, she really spends a lot of time talking about, space and place and land and all of these definitions. And I cannot remember, she does talk about space, and I cannot remember what she says about that. But I do love what she says about place, and it was something that came up when Mark and I were backing and forthing, and it was that place is somewhere seen from the inside.
Yeah.
And it's somewhere, it's a process of meaning creating that makes place. Whereas space is kind of it's kind of got, it does have an emptiness to it, but it's available online, The Lure of the Local. You can download it as a PDF. It's rare as hen's teeth to get in print, but you can download it online, and in that it has a whole chapter where she's really unravelling these things if you want to kind of have that intimate moment with a writer and translate that into your body.
Something about the intimacy and the touch,
saying.
is that's important for me. Like, you have to commit to place. You have to commit to it, and there's a reciprocity.
Yeah, I understand place because I feel place.
Yeah.
But I also think that there's intimacy in a digital space.
Yeah, these things are not...
the intimacy, I would argue, could be in a digital space, which I don't call a digital place. So yes, I understand the difference between them, but I'm just interested in your view.
It's a funny kind of thing in a way, isn't it? Because I get where you... And we were just talking about books and the power and actuality of the inchoate there, so you could argue that the same thing is true in the digital. But clearly, where I was yesterday walking on those rocks, my legs beginning to ache, my skin beginning to burn, all of that kind of stuff is place. And it's your body's on the line, you're making a commitment. I've had digital relationships. They seem real. They're not quite the same as the ones that I have in places. So where you get... I think it's about also... A place is so textural And, actual, it involves the bodies of the other forms and of the self and the encounters that we make, between them. There's something very earthy in the kind of language of good place writing that you were quoting before, that Deb quotes as well. And it's something that I revel in. I think it's such an antidote to the times that we're in. I wrote a poem on commission, actually, for a friend, to give to a friend of his, and I got to thinking that, these are times in which half the world can be your friend, but you might never actually hear the afternoon voice of that person you call your friend. I meet people and I'm thinking these days, I know you from somewhere, and they say, oh, we're on Facebook, And it is real in a sense, so we're in uncharted territory with these things. But I think it's an obvious point to make, I suppose, isn't it? But, where there's some skin in the game, where there's some actual texture and, actuality, and there's something there that the digital, can't do. And there's stuff in the actual realm there's stuff in that realm that stays in that realm. The digital's kind of got a magic about it as well. And I'm not sure we always know quite where we are in it. And I'm at risk always of sounding like a cranky old bugger pushing back against the kind of digital. But I notice among my writing students, and I think this matters. Okay, I come from suburbia in Sydney, and I teach in Sydney. It's a big city in the world and all that stuff. But I'll say to people, how many species of eucalypt do you think there are? And they kind of give you the look that's, why would that matter? How many species of bird do you think there are in Australia? And I'm going, so, sparrows or a bird is just not going to do it in your piece of writing. So there's something about the particularity and what it means to hear a bird and think, oh, that could be the ringneck. And, in the actual kind of world that makes places, there's a magic of place that's about the physical, not just the metaphysical.
Thank you so much. We will leave with the magic of place. We are over time. Thank you so much, Mark, for having a yarn tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know there is still a couple of places in the poetry workshop. Is that right? Do you want to give us a little spiel about what that Sunday workshop is? So that's Sunday 9 to 1 here?
Yeah.
Yep. At the museum.
Yeah,
yep.
Museum. So I tend to, in poetry and in my creative writing teaching, emphasize craft and technique a fair bit. So with poetry, I will touch on different forms and why form matters so much. It actually relates to the question we're just dealing with, like the form, the actual, is this a sonnet? How many beats per bar? All of that kind of thing. And also at the other end of the spectrum, stuff that I was alluding to before about why poetry matters just so very much and why the poetic in the prose world matters so very much too in terms of human survival and all of that. But craft is at the heart of it, and we'll read some fine poems and have a look at those and read some of your work, and I'll probably set, it's 4 hours, I think, isn't it? So I'll probably set a couple of writing exercises. There's a form called the Sijo, which I think I might practice with on Sunday. The Sijo is a Korean shape of thing. But yeah, craft and some great poems from across the ages, which generally work to kind of inspire people or scare them half to death. Be like, you can choose when you read a great poem to go, oh, I'm just giving up. Of course, that's just too good. Or you can go, wow, I'd love to do something like that. That I would encourage the second attitude, but I understand the first one.
Well, if you're looking to be a bit scared and inspired by poetry, have a yarn to Fiona at the back. Please put your hands together for Mark for having a chat to us here tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Fiona and the NT Writers Centre for making this happen. I think the bar's going to be open for one more drink, and otherwise, have a beautiful evening.
And buy books.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk. If you'd like to hear more talks with authors, you can head to the NT Writers website, ntwriterscentre.com.au, and hear this talk and all the other talks from the NT Writers Festival, which happened in Alice Springs in May 2019.